The legacy and the threat. The morning sun bled over the horizon, painting the sky in a gentle wash of amber and gold. For Michael, it was the most peaceful part of the day, a silent, sacred ritual that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. He stood on the porch, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hands, watching the light spread across his fields. The land, 100 acres of fertile soil, was more than just a farm. It was a living chronicle of his ancestors' toil and triumph. Every furrow he plowed held a story. A brand new charcoal gray sedan turned off the main road and pulled to a stop at the edge of his gravel driveway. The sleek, predatory vehicle looked wildly out of place against the rustic backdrop of his barn and weathered farmhouse. The man who stepped out was even more so. Mr. Thorne was a polished figure, all tailored suit and manicured nails, a stark contrast to Michael's work-worn hands and denim overalls. "Morning, Michael," Thorne said, his voice as smooth and sterile as the car he drove. He didn't bother to extend his hand. He was a man who saw no value in pleasantries. Michael just nodded, a stone-faced greeting. He dealt with Thorne and his representatives before. The offers had started as polite inquiries, then escalated to persistent calls, and now, this. "We have a final offer for you," Thorne continued, as if discussing the weather. $25 million. It's more than fair. You can't farm forever. This is your chance to retire a wealthy man. Michael took a long, slow sip of his coffee. "This isn't just about money, Mr. Thorne. This land is my family. My grandfather built that barn with his own hands. My father taught me to read the soil here." A flicker of impatience crossed Thorne's face. "Nostalgia is a luxury you can't afford. Don't be naive. We're going to build here, one way or another. It would be a lot easier for everyone if you just signed the papers." He took a folder from his car and placed it on the hood. The document lay there, a final, cold offer. Michael looked at the folder, then back at the vast expanse of his fields. The gentle morning glow now seemed to hold a darker promise. He felt a chill, a premonition that this peaceful day was a beautiful but fleeting. The charcoal gray sedan disappeared down the road. Its wake was a suffocating quiet, soon to be shattered. The very next morning, before the sun had a chance to fully crest the horizon, the silence of the countryside was ripped apart by the roar of diesel engines. Michael stood on his porch, the same porch where he had just a day ago felt the quiet solitude of his land, and watched as a convoy of heavy machinery rumbled down the dirt road bordering his property. A bulldozer, a backhoe, and a dozen dump trucks, all emblazoned with the logo of Thorne Corp, lined up along the northern fence line. They were close enough that Michael could feel the vibration through the ground, a constant low-frequency hum that burrowed deep into his bones. The operators didn't so much as glance his way, their faces hidden behind dark visors and a wall of professional indifference. They were just doing a job, following orders, but Michael knew their presence was a calculated invasion. It was a statement. "We are here. We are not leaving. You have no choice." That same afternoon, a manila envelope arrived via courier. Inside was a meticulously drafted legal document, pages of cold, sterile language that accused Michael of various boundary violations and minor code infractions. It was a baseless lawsuit designed not to win in court, but to bleed him dry with legal fees. Sarah, his wife, read it with trembling hands. Her fear was a new raw thing, a stark contrast to Michael's simmering anger. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice small. "We haven't done any of this. It's a lie." "Doesn't matter." Michael gritted out, the words tasting like ash. "It's not about the truth. It's about making our lives hell until we give in." He tried to explain the situation to the local sheriff, a man named Jim, who had known Michael's family for decades. Jim listened with a sympathetic nod, but his words were empty. "Sorry, Michael. This looks like a civil matter. Not much the police can do here." Michael saw the subtle shift in Jim's eyes, a hint of recognition and fear. Thorne Corp was a big name, a deep pocket. People in positions of power knew better than to pick a fight they couldn't win. The days that followed were a blur of escalating frustration. The constant noise became a psychological world he knew, His small, quiet corner of it was being systematically dismantled. He had always believed in fairness, in fighting with a clear conscience, but a quick drive to the mayor's office yielded no help. The mayor, a man who had once promised to protect the town's heritage, avoided eye contact, shuffling papers on his desk. "I'm sure Mr. Thorne will be a valuable asset to our community," he stammered, his words hollow. He was alone. The support systems he had always relied on, law, community, the simple belief in right and wrong, had failed him. It was a bitter, brutal lesson. The world didn't work the way he thought it did. It wasn't a battle of good versus evil. It was a battle of power versus powerlessness. As he drove home, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white, a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize within him. The old way wouldn't work. The slow, patient way of a farmer wasn't enough to fight a corporation. They wanted a fight? He would give them one. But he wouldn't use their weapons. He wouldn't fight their fight. He would find another way, a way they wouldn't see coming. The first strike was theirs, but the second, he promised himself, would be his. And it would be devastating. The broken field. The days that followed were a countdown to disaster. Michael moved with a grim, exhausted purpose, a man treading water against an unseen current. The relentless hum of Thorne Corp's machinery was a constant companion, but it was the silence that was truly unsettling. The silence of the phone not ringing with offers of help. The silence of the neighbors who, though sympathetic, were too scared to get involved. The silence of the law, which had turned a blind eye. He spent his time in the fields, working a little harder, a little faster, as if he could outrun the inevitable. The wheat, his pride and joy, was a sea of green, just weeks from harvest. The stalks stood tall and proud, heavy with the promise of a bountiful crop. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled him with a fierce and desperate hope. This harvest would be his salvation, a chance to pay the legal bills and buy some time. He told Sarah this every night, nostrils. He knew that smell. It was a powerful herbicide, the kind used to clear ground for construction. It was designed to kill everything it touched, to sterilize the very soil. Michael fell to his knees, his hands digging into the mud, his mind reeling. They hadn't just sabotaged his crop, they had poisoned his land. This was an attack not just on his livelihood, but on the very soul of his farm. The water flowed over his hands, a burning mockery of life. He felt a primal scream build in his throat, but no sound came out. The tears that fell were hot, a stark contrast to the cold mud and the poison seeping into the earth. He stood there until dawn, a statue of grief and rage. The rising sun revealed the full extent of the damage. A wide, dark swath had been cut through the middle of his field, the once vibrant wheat now shriveled and dying, its leaves turning a sickly yellow. The poison had done its job with ruthless efficiency. His hope, the one thing he had held on to, was gone, washed away by a current of spite and greed. Sarah found him there, his face streaked with dirt and tears. She didn't say anything, just wrapped her arms around him, her own body shaking with silent sobs. She had known this would happen. She had seen the writing on the wall, but seeing the broken field, the broken man, was a different kind of pain. The local authorities, when they finally arrived, were no help. They found no evidence, no fingerprints, no witnesses. "Looks like a faulty pipe, Michael. Maybe some kind of runoff from the road," the sheriff said, his eyes carefully avoiding Michael's. It was a thinly veiled lie, a final act of the trail. He was ruined. He couldn't harvest. He couldn't plant. The debt collectors would be calling soon. And in the distance, the machines of Thorne Corp had stopped. They didn't need to work anymore. They had won. Or so they thought. As Michael stood in the middle of his dead field, a new feeling took hold. Not despair. Land. Michael, in a suit that felt alien and constricting, sat beside the local lawyer, a man who looked like he was already counting the cost of his inevitable failure. Across the aisle sat Thorne, a shark in a tailored suit, his eyes glinting with a cold, predatory satisfaction. He had won. He was just here to watch the formality. The judge, a wary man who had probably seen this same story play out a dozen times, listened to Thorne's lawyer lay out the case. The lawyer spoke in a monotone, listing financial figures and legal precedents that seemed designed to make Michael's life sound like a mathematical problem with an obvious, unfortunate solution. He produced doctored aerial photos that showed Michael's farm as a derelict wasteland and presented a falsified report on the broken irrigation system, a report that conveniently omitted the fact that the water was poisoned. Michael's lawyer tried to counter, but his arguments were weak. He was outmatched, out-resourced. The truth in this room was a commodity, and Thorne had bought all of it. Michael felt a slow, simmering rage build inside him. This wasn't justice. This was a slaughter. He saw his family's history, their sweat and blood, being reduced to a footnote in a legal brief. He saw Sarah's tears, the broken wheat stalks, the silence of a town that had turned its back on him. At a recess, as Michael sat alone on a cold wooden bench, Thorne approached him. He didn't sit down, choosing instead to stand over him, a statue of arrogant power.
You know, you could have made this easy on yourself, Michael,
Thorne said, his voice a low, condescending whisper.
You could have been on a beach right now, sipping a margarita. But you had to be a hero. You had to fight. And now look at you. You've lost everything. The farm, the money, your dignity.
Michael looked up at him, his eyes burning with the fire Thorne couldn't possibly comprehend.
I haven't lost anything yet,
Michael said, his voice a low growl.
Not to you.
Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh.
Oh, you will. The judge will rule in my favor. The bank will foreclose. I'll own this place by the end of the month. It's owned.
Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine surprise and then pure, unadulterated fury. The game had just changed. Michael had stopped fighting to survive and started fighting to destroy. The war was no longer about his farm. It was about revenge, and it would be cold, meticulous, and delivered with the farmer's patience. The secret of the swampland. Michael didn't go home after the courtroom. He drove past his barren fields, past the silent machines of Thorne Corp, and kept going until the paved road gave way to a winding, rutted track. He was on a pilgrimage, not to a place of worship, but to the land itself. The legal battle was over, and he had lost. The courtroom was Thorne's domain, so be it. Michael was going to take the fight to his own territory, and he knew just the person to consult. He found old man Silas in the small rustic cabin, half hidden by a thicket of willows on the edge of the wetlands. Silas was a living legend in these parts, a retired park ranger and self-proclaimed guardian of the old ways. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his hands were gnarled roots, and his eyes held the deep, quiet wisdom of a man who has spent his life listening to the land.
Heard you've got trouble,
Silas said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. He gestured for Michael to sit on a worn wooden bench. Michael, not one for small talk, got right to the point. He explained everything, the threats, the poison, the court case. As he spoke, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Silas listened patiently, nodding.
It ain't just your land he wants,
Silas said when Michael had finished.
He wants all of it, the whole valley. Been trying to buy me out for years, too.
Michael's eyes widened.
He's after you, too?
Silas smiled, a slow, knowing grin.
Oh, he's after more than just the land, boy. He's after what's underneath it.
He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper.
This whole area, from your farm to my shack and beyond, it's all part of what we used to call the Whispering Marsh. It's a natural wetland, one of the last remaining ones in the state.
Michael's mind began to race. He had heard of the whisper drawing. Is the rare water lily. Grows in only a few places in North America. Both are right there on his land, too. He looked up at Michael, his eyes sharp and serious. The law might not care about an honest man's farm, but it cares about endangered species. And the public? They care about corporate villains destroying our heritage for profit. You can't beat Thorne with a deed or a lawsuit. You gotta beat him with the truth. You gotta show them what he's really hiding. Michael felt a surge of energy, a focus he hadn't had since the court case. This was it. A new plan. He wasn't going to beg for justice. He was going to earn it. His knowledge of the land, his patience, his silent observation, these were the weapons he would use. Thorne had a legal team. Michael had a dying farmer and the living memory of the land. The game had just changed. He was no longer a victim. He was a hunter. Met gathering the living evidence. Michael's plan was now a chillingly precise blueprint for revenge. The legal battle had been a public, noisy spectacle. But this new war would be fought in the shadows, a silent, meticulous campaign. He sold his last remaining tractor and used the money to buy a handful of high-definition trail cameras, solar-powered and motion-activated, along with some advanced field guides and a pair of professional-grade binoculars. He was no longer a farmer. He was a detective, and the land was his crime scene. He began his nightly patrols after dark, moving with the quiet grace of a man who knew every dip and curve of the terrain. The air was cool and thick with the scent of damp earth. Michael would spend hours meticulously placing the cameras in strategic locations around the edge of the Whispering Marsh, a name that now felt less like a legend and more like a promise. He camouflaged each one with twigs and leaves, making them invisible to the casual observer. He was careful to stay off the land itself, working only from the periphery, his boots sinking into the soft, loamy soil at the edge of the woods. His patience, a trait honed by decades of farming, was now a formidable weapon. That Thorne's environmental reports were a lie. One night, the motion sensor on a camera near the main construction road went off. Michael, checking the memory card the next day, saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a picture of a Thorne Corp foreman, a burly man with a permanent scowl, in the act of tearing down a nesting box that a local conservation group had put up years ago. The next photo showed him stuffing it into a garbage bag. It was a small act, a petty crime, but it proved their deliberate disregard for the environment. It was the human face of their destruction. He felt a rush of adrenaline, a sense of righteous purpose he hadn't experienced since the legal battles began. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about them, the voiceless victims of Thorne's greed. He had the photos, the videos, and the meticulous notes. He had the truth. Now, he just had to find the right person to show it to. His patience was paying off, and the first piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. Thorne had chosen to fight him in the open, but Michael would defeat him from the shadows, with the silent, powerful force of the truth. The unlikely ally. The photographs and videos were his ammunition, but Michael knew he couldn't fire them alone. He needed a voice, a megaphone, someone who could take his raw, damning evidence and make it heard. His search led him to a name he'd seen on a local news blog, Maya Sanchez. She was a young, tenacious environmental activist known for her fiery articles and her refusal to back down. Her recent piece on a city park being rezoned for a shopping center had ruffled more than a few feathers. She was a fighter. Michael found her office in a small, cramped space above a coffee shop, the air thick with the scent of roasted beans and the faint aroma of stale paper. Maya was younger than he expected, with a sharp, intelligent gaze and a laptop covered in activist stickers. "Thanks for meeting me," Michael said, feeling awkward in his work boots and worn jacket. Maya looked him over, her expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "You said you have proof that Thorne Corp is violating environmental laws. I get a dozen tips a week. Most of them are just frustrating."
"Dunk," she said, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "They lied on an official document. That's a felony."
For the next 2 hours, Michael laid out everything. The timeline of Thorne's pressure tactics, the poisoning of his field, the doctored court documents. Maya listened intently, her skepticism replaced by a fierce, focused determination. She peppered him with questions about dates, about locations, about the exact species of flora and fauna. She was a professional, a meticulous researcher, and Michael realized he had found his perfect ally. "We can't just give this to the state environmental agency," Maya explained. "They might just bury it, especially if Thorne's got people on the inside. We have to go public. We have to make this a national story. We'll present the evidence, tell your story, and show the world what kind of man Mr. Thorne really is." A sense of hope, a fragile, tentative thing, took root in Michael's chest. For the first time since the ordeal began, he wasn't alone. He had found someone who believed in his cause, someone who was not afraid to fight. As he stood to leave, Maya reached across the table and shook his hand, her grip firm and confident. "Don't worry, Michael," she said, a small, fierce smile on her face. "The truth is on our side, and the truth, when it's this ugly, has a way of getting people's attention." Michael walked out of the coffee shop feeling lighter than he had in months. The weight of his burden was now shared. He had found a new kind of family, a new kind of community. The quiet conspiracy had a co-conspirator, the farmer and the activist, a formidable if unlikely pair. They had the evidence, they had the story, and now they had a plan to take down a giant. The financial trap. Michael and Maya's plan was a two-pronged attack, one public and one utterly private. While Maya began drafting her exposé, gathering quotes from environmental experts and preparing to launch a full-scale media campaign, Michael was focused on the silent financial arm of their revenge. He knew Thorne's weakness wasn't a bad headline, it was a missed deadline. He recalled Thorne's smug arrogance, Corp's project by its permit number, and stated that new, verifiable evidence suggested the presence of a federally protected wetland and endangered species on the site. He included no personal details, just a single, nondescript link to an encrypted folder containing a few of the most damning photographs of the spotted harrier and the rare water lily. The next morning, from the cab of his old truck, Michael watched the construction site. For weeks it had been a hive of activity. Now it was eerily quiet. A few men in hard hats stood around, looking confused, while a pair of official-looking vehicles with State Environmental Commission logos pulled up. Thorne's site foreman, a man whose face Michael recognized from the trail camera footage, rushed out to meet them, his gestures wild and frantic. Michael felt a surge of cold, focused satisfaction. This was it. Thorne's house of cards was built on a foundation of lies and a tight timeline. The email, a few lines of text and a handful of photos, had done what no lawyer or protest could have done in a single day. It had forced a halt. It had put the brakes on Thorne's entire operation. As the day wore on, Michael saw the frustrated Thorne himself arrive, his face a mask of furious disbelief. He was yelling into his phone, his voice a low, impotent roar from a distance. The bank was likely on the other end, demanding an explanation, threatening to pull funding. Michael knew that Thorne would eventually find a way to get the site cleared, but for now, the gears of his financial machine had ground to a halt. The cost of this single, unexpected delay would run into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. Thorne was now bleeding money. The man who had used financial leverage to crush Michael was now being crushed by the very same force. Michael had taken the high ground, not with a legal brief, but with the quiet, devastating power of truth. The battlefield had been leveled, and now the real fight could begin. Aesthesia. The unexpected inspection. The following day, Michael drove to the outskirts of town and parked his old truck on a secluded hill overlooking the Thorne Corp site. From his vantage point, he watched the drama unfold like a spectator at a play he had written himself. The air was thick with tension. A state-marked sedan and a large, official-looking white van were specific, and they were following it to the letter. Thorne, the man who prided himself on control, was losing it. He arrived in a blur of black luxury and stepped out of his car, his face a furious crimson. He immediately confronted the inspectors, his voice a low, angry roar that Michael could almost feel from a quarter-mile away. But the inspectors stood their ground, calmly holding up a clipboard and pointing at specific regulations. Thorne was a master of legal maneuver, but he was powerless against a real-world inspection and the cold, hard facts of environmental law. The tension on the site was palpable. Workers milled around, confused and idle. The machinery, once a symbol of power and progress, now sat silent and useless. For every minute the machines were still, money was hemorrhaging from Thorne Corp. The bank's deadline was now a ticking time bomb, and the inspectors were holding the detonator. Suddenly, Michael saw something that made him lower his binoculars and smile. One of the inspectors stooped down and carefully examined a clump of reeds near the edge of the supposed dry land. Michael knew exactly what he was looking at, the unique plant species he had documented. The inspector then took out his phone and snapped a few photos. He was building a case, piece by piece, right on Thorne's property. Michael felt a profound sense of satisfaction. It was a victory, but a quiet one. The legal battle had been loud and public, but this win was silent, delivered with the stealth of a whisper. He hadn't needed to shout or protest. He had used Thorne's own arrogance against him. He had exposed the rot at the core of Thorne's empire, and now the whole thing was starting to crumble. The environmental inspection was just the first domino, a direct result of his anonymous tip. Thorne was now caught in a web of his own lies, and Michael, the humble farmer, held the first thread. The game was far from over, but for the first time, Michael felt like he was finally winning. The news of the halted project spread like wildfire. The town, which had been rat. Gus, a man who saw no moral shades of gray, went straight for the most likely suspect. He started by putting out feelers, making some discreet inquiries with the local sheriff's department. The information was thin, but one name kept coming up as a potential troublemaker: Michael. He was the one who had refused to sell, the one with the most to lose. Gus drove out to Michael's farm, his black SUV a silent predator stalking its prey. Michael, working in his barn, saw the vehicle pull up. He felt a familiar nod of dread, but this time it was laced with a new, cold resolve. He was no longer a victim. He was a player in this dangerous game. Gus stepped out of the car,
his massive frame blocking out the afternoon sun. He didn't speak. His silence was a weapon, a form of intimidation. "Looking for me?" Michael asked, leaning on a shovel, his gaze unwavering. "Thorne's not happy," Gus said, his voice a low rumble. "He wants to know why you're interfering with his business." "I'm not interfering with anything," Michael replied, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm just a farmer who lost his crop." "Looks like your boss lost something too." Gus's face hardened. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowed into slits. "You're playing a dangerous game, farm boy. You think you're smart, sending some anonymous tips. Thorne doesn't like surprises, and when he's angry, he makes sure everyone involved gets hurt." He didn't make a direct threat, but the message was clear. It was a thinly veiled warning, a promise of violence. Michael, however, didn't flinch. He looked at the hulking man, and for the first time, he felt no fear. He had faced down Thorne's lawyers, his poisoned water, and his legal threats. This was just another round. "Tell Mr. Thorne," Michael said, his voice as calm as a still pond, "that I'm not playing a game. I'm just helping him find out who he really is." Gus's expression turned from menacing to pure fury. He took a step back, a promise of future retribution in his eyes, and got back in his car. As he drove away, Michael's cylinders pointed at him like a firing squad. Maya took the lead, her voice strong and clear as she laid out the case. She spoke about the importance of protecting local ecosystems and the dangers of unchecked corporate greed. Her words were powerful, but the real punch came when she unveiled the evidence. On a large screen behind them, the pictures and videos Michael had spent weeks capturing began to play. The crowd gasped as the first image of the spotted harrier, a beautiful, federally protected bird, filled the screen. A video clip followed, showing Thorne's foreman actively tearing down a nesting box. Then came the damning evidence of the poisoned soil, with side-by-side photos of Michael's once thriving wheat field and the now dead swath of land. Finally, Michael stepped up to the microphone. His voice was rough, unaccustomed to public speaking, but it was filled with a deep, raw honesty. He didn't talk about legal jargon or environmental regulations. He spoke about his family, about the legacy of his land, and about the quiet dignity of a farmer's life. He described the fear and despair he felt when his harvest was destroyed. But then he spoke about the renewed purpose he found in fighting for something bigger than himself. He looked directly into the cameras and said, "Mr. Thorne didn't just try to take my farm. He tried to kill the land itself. He took my harvest, but he couldn't take the truth. And the truth, it turns out, is a lot stronger than his money." The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. The reporters began shouting questions. The news went from a local story to a national sensation. Within hours, clips of Michael's speech and Maya's evidence were playing on major networks. The public outcry was massive. Thorne Corp stock plummeted further, and government officials, now under immense public pressure, announced a full-scale criminal investigation. Thorne, watching the press conference from his office, felt a sense of panic he hadn't experienced since he was a young man with nothing. He had relied on his power and his money to crush his enemies, but Michael, the man he had dismissed as a simple farmer, had outmaneuvered him completely. He had used the one thing Thorne couldn't buy, coerce, or intimidate: the truth. It was a humiliating public defeat. The battle for the farm was over, but the war for Thorne's unprecedented pace. His bank had officially pulled its funding, forcing him to halt not just this project, but several others across the state. His reputation was in tatters, and he was facing a barrage of lawsuits and criminal charges. The news reported that he had been formally indicted. Michael didn't feel a rush of glee. The revenge he had sought wasn't about pleasure. It was about justice. The cold, hard satisfaction was in seeing that justice served. A few days later, a new letter arrived. This one wasn't from a lawyer. It was from the Thorne Corporation itself,
signed by Thorne's legal team. It was a complete capitulation. They were dropping the lawsuit against him and offering a substantial financial settlement, far more than the value of his farm, in exchange for his silence. It was a desperate, final attempt to contain the damage. Michael didn't hesitate. He took the check and signed the papers, not for the money, but for the principal. The money was just a bonus, a restitution for the theft of his peace. With the settlement, Michael didn't just rebuild his life, he rebuilt his legacy. He used the funds to not only restore his poisoned fields, a process that would take years of dedicated work, but also to establish a local conservation fund in his family's name. Its purpose was to monitor and protect the very wetlands Thorne had tried to destroy. The Whispering Marsh was officially designated a protected area, a quiet monument to his victory. In the end, Michael stood in the middle of his field, no longer a victim, but a survivor. The air was clean, the silence was his own again, and the land, though scarred, was healing. He looked at the horizon, a sunrise painting the sky with colors as vibrant as his renewed hope. He had fought a giant, not with the giant's own weapons of money and power, but with the quiet, unyielding strength of the land itself. The injustice had been repaid, not with violence, but with a powerful truth. He had gotten his farm back, but he had also restored something far more important: his dignity, his peace, and the soul of his land.